A wealthy farmer's life is shattered when his beloved wife dies in childbirth, leaving him devastated and vengeful. In his grief, he orders the death of his newborn son, but fate intervenes. Years later, on the brink of death, the farmer's only chance for survival lies in the hands of a mysterious young man. As buried secrets come to light, the farmer must confront the shocking truth that could either save or destroy him. In a story where redemption comes at a steep price, prepare for a twist that will leave you breathless. Chapter 1, Love and Loss. Scene 1, A Chance Meeting. Ezekiel Ford stood at the edge of the bustling market, surveying the scene with his usual detached demeanor. The air was thick with the scent of fresh produce, the chatter of townsfolk, and the clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Ezekiel was here on business, as always, overseeing the sale of his farm's latest harvest. Yet today, something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. Across the market, a young woman stood behind a table adorned with homemade goods. Her delicate features, framed by long, auburn hair, were softened by a warm smile as she handed a jar of preserves to a customer. There was a gentle grace in her movements, a quiet kindness in her eyes. Ezekiel felt a strange warmth stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He watched her for a while, unnoticed, before finally approaching. "Miss, are these your wares?" he asked, his voice gruffer than intended. The woman looked up, her brown eyes meeting his with a hint of curiosity. "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "Would you like to try some?" "My name is Abigail." Ezekiel Ford, he introduced himself, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than necessary. "I'll take one of each." As she wrapped the items, Ezekiel found himself captivated by her gentle demeanor. When she handed him the neatly wrapped package, their fingers brushed, sending a small jolt through him. "Thank you, Mr. Ford," Abigail said with a smile that seemed to brighten the market. Ezekiel nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he walked away. But even as he left, he knew this would not be the last time he saw Abigail. Scene 2, The Proposal. Weeks passed, and Ezekiel found himself returning to the market more frequently, each time with an excuse to buy something from Abigail. Their conversations grew longer, and Ezekiel, once a man of few words, found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't thought possible. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ezekiel rode out to Abigail's modest home on the outskirts of town. The small cottage, surrounded by a neat garden, was a stark contrast to the grandeur of his own estate. He dismounted and approached the door, his heart uncharacteristically heavy with nerves. Abigail greeted him with a smile, inviting him inside. They sat by the fire, talking about the changing seasons, the harvest, and the future. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ezekiel cleared his throat. "Abigail," he began, his voice steady but soft, "these past few months have been different for me. You've brought something into my life that I didn't realize I was missing. I know we come from different worlds, and I'm much older, but, would you consider becoming my wife?" Abigail's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, the room was silent. She had grown fond of Ezekiel, despite his gruff exterior. She saw the loneliness in him, the goodness buried beneath years of hardened resolve. "Yes, Ezekiel," she finally whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I will." Ezekiel reached out, taking her hand in his. For the first time in years, he felt hope for a future filled with something more than just wealth and power. Scene 3, The Wedding. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the quaint church at the center of the small town. The townsfolk gathered, more out of curiosity than anything else. Whispers of the unlikely match circulated among the guests, but Ezekiel paid them no mind. His focus was solely on Abigail. As Abigail walked down the aisle, her white dress flowing behind her, Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. She was radiant, a vision of purity and grace. When she reached him, he took her hand, squeezing it gently. The ceremony was short, and soon they were pronounced husband and wife. The townspeople clapped politely, though some still murmured about the unusual pair. But as they left the church, Ezekiel felt a deep sense of contentment. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. "Thank you, Abigail," he whispered as they rode back to his estate. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at life." Abigail smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We'll build a beautiful life together, Ezekiel. You'll see." Scene 4, The Joy of Expectation. Months passed, and the newlyweds settled into a comfortable routine. Abigail's presence softened Ezekiel's rough edges, and he found himself smiling more, laughing even. His workers noticed the change, and the atmosphere on the farm became lighter, more joyful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the fields, Abigail and Ezekiel sat on the porch of their home. Abigail reached for Ezekiel's hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Ezekiel, I have some news," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. "What is it?" Ezekiel asked, his heart skipping a beat at the look in her eyes. "I'm pregnant," Abigail whispered, her smile widening as she placed his hand on her belly. For a moment, Ezekiel was speechless. Then, a wide grin spread across his face, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "A child," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Ezekiel's mind filled with dreams of the future. He imagined teaching his son or daughter how to work the land, sharing the values his father had instilled in him. He imagined growing old with Abigail, watching their child grow into a strong, kind-hearted adult. But the future, as bright as it seemed, held a darkness that neither of them could foresee. Scene 5, Tragedy Strikes. The night was dark and stormy when Abigail went into labor. The midwife was called, and the household was thrown into a frenzy. Ezekiel paced the halls, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Hours passed, and the cries of pain from the bedroom grew louder, more desperate. Ezekiel wanted to be by Abigail's side, to comfort her, but the midwife had insisted he wait outside. The tension in the air was palpable, and Ezekiel's mind raced with worry. Finally, the cries stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Ezekiel's heart froze. He rushed to the bedroom, bursting through the door, only to be met with the sight of the midwife holding a newborn baby, his son. But Abigail lay still on the bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. "No," Ezekiel whispered, his voice breaking. He fell to his knees beside the bed, taking Abigail's lifeless hand in his. "Abigail, no." The midwife placed the crying baby in Ezekiel's arms, but he couldn't bring himself to look at the child. All he could see was the loss of the woman he loved, the woman who had brought light into his life. Grief quickly turned to anger, and in a moment of madness, Ezekiel called for Samuel, his trusted foreman. "Take him," Ezekiel said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Take him away and kill him." Samuel, shocked and horrified, hesitated. "Sir, I do it." Ezekiel barked, his eyes wild with grief. "I can't bear the sight of him. He took her from me." Trembling, Samuel took the baby from Ezekiel's arms. He looked down at the innocent child, his heart heavy with sorrow. Without another word, he turned and left the room, the baby's cries echoing through the hallways. As Ezekiel collapsed onto the bed, his world shattered around him. He had no way of knowing that the choice he had just made would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chapter 2, The Foreman's Dilemma. Scene 1, The Command. Samuel Green stood silently in the doorway of Ezekiel's bedroom, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor. Abigail's lifeless form lay still on the bed, and the only sound was the faint cry of the newborn in Samuel's arms. Ezekiel, hunched over in despair, looked up with hollow eyes that spoke of a grief too deep for words. "Take him," Ezekiel ordered, his voice cold and empty. "Take him away and end it." Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the man he had served for decades. "Sir, are you sure? He's just a baby, your son." Ezekiel's eyes flashed with anger. "He's the reason she's gone. I don't want to see him. Do what I've asked, Samuel. Now." Samuel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew Ezekiel was blinded by grief, but the command was clear. He had no choice but to obey, or so it seemed. "As you wish, Mr. Ford," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. With a heavy heart, Samuel turned and left the room, the baby's cries echoing in the silent hallway. As he walked, the weight of Ezekiel's order bore down on him, leaving him in turmoil. Scene 2, The Escape. The stables were eerily quiet as Samuel approached with the baby cradled in his arms. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The horse, sensing the tension, shifted uneasily in its stall. Samuel gently placed the baby in a basket lined with blankets, ensuring the child was warm and secure. The infant's cries had quieted, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Samuel's hands trembled as he saddled the horse, his mind grappling with the decision he was about to make. He couldn't do it. He couldn't take the life of an innocent child, no matter how much Ezekiel demanded it. The thought of carrying out such a cruel act sickened him to his core. "Forgive me, Ezekiel," Samuel murmured as he mounted the horse. "But I cannot do what you've asked." With a determined heart, Samuel urged the horse into a gallop, heading away from the farm and toward a distant city where no one knew of Ezekiel Ford or his newborn son. The night was dark, the only light coming from the pale moon above. Samuel rode with a sense of urgency, knowing that the further they got from the farm, the safer the child would be. His mind raced with thoughts of what would come next, how he would protect the boy, how he would raise him as his own. The journey was long and arduous, but Samuel pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a fierce desire to do what was right. He had made his decision, he would save the child, even if it meant betraying his master. Scene 3, A New Life. As dawn broke, Samuel arrived in a small, quiet town far from Ford family farm. The town was just beginning to stir, with shopkeepers opening their doors and the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. Samuel felt a sense of relief wash over him. This would be their new home, a place where the child could grow up safely, far from the pain and bitterness that had consumed his father. Samuel carried the baby into a modest cottage at the edge of town. The house was small, but it was warm and welcoming, with a well-tended garden and a view of the distant hills. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for the two of them. He sat down in a rocking chair by the fire, cradling the baby in his arms. "Noah," he whispered, the name coming to him as if by instinct. "I'll call you Noah." As he rocked the baby to sleep, Samuel made a vow to himself and to the child. He would raise Noah as his own, protect him, and give him the life he deserved. The truth of his birth would remain a secret, locked away in the depths of Samuel's heart. And so, a new life began for both of them. Samuel found work as a laborer in the town, doing what he could to provide for Noah. The years passed quietly, and Samuel took pride in watching Noah grow into a strong, kind-hearted boy, much like his mother, though Noah would never know it. Scene 4, The years pass. The years rolled by, and the once tiny infant grew into a curious and determined young boy. Noah, now around 10 years old, was full of questions and a boundless energy that kept Samuel on his toes. The two had developed a deep bond, one that went beyond that of a typical father and son. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Noah paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Pa," he began, looking up at Samuel with wide, innocent eyes, "how come I don't look like you?" Samuel froze for a moment, caught off guard by the question he had always dreaded. He had known this day would come, but he still wasn't prepared. "Well, Noah," he started, choosing his words carefully, "sometimes family isn't about looking the same. It's about who cares for you, who raises you. That's what makes us family." Noah seemed to consider this, his brow furrowing in thought. "I guess that makes sense," he finally said, giving Samuel a small smile. "But I'm glad you're my pa." Samuel's heart swelled with love and pride, but also with a pang of guilt. He had kept the truth from Noah for so long, and the boy's innocent words only deepened his resolve to protect him from the harsh realities of his past. As Noah grew, Samuel taught him the values of hard work and humility. The boy took to the lessons well, showing a natural talent for understanding people and solving problems. Yet, despite the happy life they had built together, Samuel could never completely escape the shadow of the secret he kept. Scene 5, Ezekiel's decline. Meanwhile, back at Ford family farm, Ezekiel's life had taken a darker turn. The once vibrant and powerful man had aged considerably. His health began to deteriorate, and his once booming voice was now a rasping whisper. The farm, once a source of pride, now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Ezekiel spent his days in solitude, haunted by the memory of Abigail and the child he had cast away. The weight of his actions bore down on him, and despite his wealth, he found no solace in material comforts. The grand estate, filled with reminders of his success, now felt empty and lifeless. Late one evening, Ezekiel sat by the fire, staring into the flames as memories of the past flooded his mind. He thought of Abigail, of the love they had shared, and of the child he had banished from his life. Regret gnawed at him, an unrelenting pain that no amount of wealth or power could ease. "Abigail," he whispered into the silence, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But the house offered no comfort, and the shadows of his past only grew darker. Ezekiel's health continued to decline, and soon it became clear that his time was running out. The doctors could do little for him, and though his family tried to offer support, he found himself drifting further away from them. In his darkest moments, Ezekiel wondered what had become of the child, if Samuel had carried out his orders, or if the boy had somehow survived. The thought of facing the consequences of his actions filled him with a fear he had never known before. As Ezekiel's condition worsened, the need for a transplant became apparent, but none of his family members were a match. Desperation set in as Ezekiel realized that the one thing he had always counted on, his wealth and influence, could not save him now. And so, with the shadows of his past closing in on him, Ezekiel was left to confront the reality of his choices. The stage was set for the return of the son he had once cast away, though Ezekiel could not have known the fateful reunion that awaited him. The story now moves toward a collision course, where the decisions made years ago will come back to haunt Ezekiel, and where the true price of redemption will be revealed. Chapter 3, The Revelation. Scene 1, The Search for a Donor. Ezekiel Ford lay in a sterile hospital room, his body frail and weak. The once powerful and imposing man was now a shadow of his former self, with sunken cheeks and lifeless eyes. The doctors had delivered the grim news: without a transplant, Ezekiel's days were numbered. His children, extended family, and even distant relatives had all been tested, but none were a match. Ezekiel's wealth and power, which had once seemed limitless, were now useless in the face of his mortality. As the doctors left the room, Ezekiel's daughter, Clara, stood by his bedside, her eyes filled with worry. "We'll find a match, Father," she said, trying to sound hopeful. "There has to be someone out there." Ezekiel turned his head slowly to look at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What good is all this money, Clara, if it can't save my life?" His words were laced with bitterness, a stark contrast to the confidence he had once exuded. Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We won't give up," she promised. "There has to be someone." But even as she spoke, both knew the odds were growing slimmer by the day. Ezekiel's empire, built on the foundation of his unyielding will, was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he was truly helpless. Scene 2, The Stranger's Offer. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Ezekiel's condition worsened, and the hospital room became a place of constant tension and dread. Family members visited less frequently, their inability to help filling them with guilt and sorrow. One afternoon, as Clara sat alone in the waiting room, a young man entered, his presence almost unnoticed amidst the quiet despair. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and striking green eyes that seemed to hold a quiet strength. He approached Clara cautiously, his hands clasped in front of him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I heard about your father's condition. I'd like to offer to be tested as a donor." Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. "That's very kind of you, but, who are you?" The young man hesitated for a moment before answering. "My name is Noah. I think it's the right thing to do." Clara studied him, sensing a sincerity in his words. "Thank you, Noah. I'll let the doctors know." As Noah walked away, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this stranger than met the eye. But in her desperation, she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the sliver of hope he had brought. Scene 3, The Shocking Truth. The following day, the doctors delivered unexpected news: Noah was a perfect match for Ezekiel. The family was elated, but for Noah, the revelation brought a deep sense of unease. He had come to the hospital with the intention of helping, but the reality of what he was about to do weighed heavily on him. As the surgery approached, Noah spent time alone, reflecting on his decision. Samuel had told him the truth about his origins years ago, and though he had long wrestled with the knowledge, he had never sought out Ezekiel, until now. The surgery was a success. Ezekiel's life had been saved, but the real test was yet to come. As Ezekiel began to recover, he asked to meet the young man who had given him a second chance at life. When Noah entered the hospital room, Ezekiel was struck by a sense of familiarity. The young man's features bore a striking resemblance to someone he had tried to forget, Abigail. Ezekiel's voice trembled as he spoke. "Who are you?" Noah met his gaze, his green eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. "My name is Noah. I'm your son." The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. He stared at Noah, his mind racing back to the night he had ordered the child's death. The child he had condemned was standing before him, alive and well, having just saved his life. Ezekiel's hands shook as he reached out, his voice barely audible. "No, it can't be. I ordered you to be killed." Noah finished, his tone calm but firm. "Yes, you did. But Samuel couldn't go through with it. He raised me instead, far away from here." Ezekiel felt a surge of emotions: shock, guilt, regret. He had never imagined this moment, had never thought he would have to face the consequences of that terrible night. "I'm sorry," Ezekiel whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry." Scene 4, The Offer of Atonement. The room was thick with tension as Ezekiel tried to comprehend the enormity of what had just been revealed. He looked at Noah, his son, and felt a crushing weight of guilt pressing down on him. "Noah," Ezekiel began, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to make amends. I want to leave everything to you, the farm, the wealth, all of it. It's yours, if you'll have it." Noah's expression remained unreadable as he listened to his father's offer. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ezekiel would try to use his wealth to atone for the past. But Noah had already made up his mind. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "I don't want your money. You can't buy forgiveness, and you can't undo what you did. I came here to help because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted anything from you." Ezekiel stared at him, stunned by the rejection. "But, you saved my life. I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," Noah replied, his voice softening. "The man who raised me taught me that life is about more than wealth or power. It's about the choices we make, the people we care for, and the values we hold dear. I don't want your fortune, Ezekiel. I just want you to understand the true cost of your actions. Ezekiel's shoulders slumped, the full weight of Noah's words sinking in. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. His wealth, his influence, none of it mattered in the face of his son's quiet, unyielding integrity. Scene 5, the final confrontation. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence. Ezekiel remained in the hospital, recovering from the surgery, but his mind was consumed by the revelation that had shattered his world. He had been given a second chance at life, but at what cost? Noah visited once more before leaving the hospital for good. He stood by Ezekiel's bedside, looking down at the man who had once been a giant in his eyes, now reduced to a frail and broken figure. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Ezekiel asked, his voice filled with desperation. Noah shook his head. There's nothing you can do to change the past, Ezekiel. What's done is done. But you can choose how you live the rest of your life. Whether you continue to cling to your wealth and power or find a way to make amends, it's up to you. Ezekiel looked up at his son, tears streaming down his face. I don't know how to atone for what I did, he admitted. But I want to try. Noah's expression softened, and for a moment, there was a glimmer of something that resembled forgiveness. Then start by letting go of the things that don't matter, he said. Start by being the man my mother believed you could be. With those words, Noah turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ezekiel to grapple with the reality of his situation. As the door closed behind him, Ezekiel felt an overwhelming sense of loss, but also a sliver of hope. He had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at redemption. But whether he could seize that chance remained to be seen. As Noah stepped out of the hospital and into the bright sunlight, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He had done what he came to do, and now, it was time to move on. The story of Ezekiel Ford was far from over, but for Noah, the chapter had come to a close. He would return to the life he had built with Samuel, far away from the wealth and power that had destroyed so much. And as Ezekiel faced the long road to redemption, he knew that the true price of his actions could never be paid with money or material wealth. It was a debt that could only be settled through the recognition of his own humanity and the choices he made from that day forward. Chapter 4, Redemption and Reflection. Scene 1, The Aftermath. The Grand Ford family farm, once a symbol of power and success, had become a place of solitude and regret. Ezekiel Ford, now a man broken by the weight of his choices, returned to the estate after his life-saving surgery. The sprawling fields that once filled him with pride now seemed empty, devoid of the life and joy they once held. Ezekiel wandered the grounds, his steps slow and heavy. The memories of Abigail and the love they shared haunted him at every turn. He paused by the porch where they used to sit together, the place where Abigail had told him she was pregnant. The joy he had felt in that moment was a distant memory, replaced by the sorrow of all he had lost. He entered the grand, empty house, the silence pressing down on him. Every room echoed with the ghosts of the past, a stark reminder of the choices he had made. Ezekiel sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. His wealth and power had brought him nothing but misery, and the realization that he had driven away the one person who could have given him solace, his son, was almost too much to bear. But as he sat there, he knew that his life wasn't over yet. There was still time, still a chance to make things right, even if he could never undo the past. Scene 2, A Visit from Samuel. Late one afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows over the farm, Ezekiel heard the sound of footsteps approaching the house. He looked up to see Samuel Green standing at the edge of the porch, his weathered face a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Samuel," Ezekiel said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't expect to see you here." Samuel nodded, stepping forward. "I thought it was time we talked, Ezekiel. There's been too much left unsaid between us." Ezekiel motioned for Samuel to join him on the porch, and the two men sat down, the weight of years between them. They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Samuel," Ezekiel finally admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But none more terrible than what I asked you to do." Samuel sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know you were grieving, Ezekiel. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't take the life of that innocent boy. So I took him far away, raised him as my own." Ezekiel swallowed hard, his heart aching at the thought of the son he had never known. "You did the right thing, Samuel. I see that now." Samuel looked at Ezekiel, his eyes filled with compassion. "Noah's a good man, Ezekiel. He's got a kind heart, just like his mother. He doesn't want your wealth or your land. He just wanted to help you, to do what was right." Ezekiel nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I know, Samuel. And that's what makes it so hard. I don't deserve his forgiveness, but I want to find a way to make things right." Samuel placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and understanding. "You can't change the past, Ezekiel. But you can choose how you live the rest of your life. Maybe that's where you'll find your redemption." Scene 3, Ezekiel's attempt at atonement. Determined to make amends, Ezekiel made the journey to the small town where Samuel and Noah lived. The town was simple, its people kind and welcoming, a stark contrast to the cold grandeur of Ford family farm. Ezekiel walked through the streets, feeling out of place but resolute in his mission. He found Noah at the local church, helping with repairs. Noah looked up as Ezekiel approached, his expression unreadable. "Noah," Ezekiel began, his voice filled with sincerity, "I've come to see if there's any way I can make amends for what I did." Noah set down his tools, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You can't buy forgiveness, Ezekiel," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "And I don't need anything from you. Samuel gave me everything I needed, a home, a family, and values that money can't buy." Ezekiel's shoulders slumped, the rejection hitting him harder than he expected. "I understand," he said quietly. "But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." Noah nodded, his gaze softening. "I know you are. But the best thing you can do is live your life differently from now on. Use what you have to help others, to make a difference. That's how you can atone." Ezekiel looked at Noah, seeing in him the same quiet strength that had drawn him to Abigail all those years ago. "I'll do that, Noah," he promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." Noah gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his work, leaving Ezekiel to make the long journey back to the farm, knowing that the path to redemption would be a long and difficult one. Scene 4, A Life of Reflection. Back at the farm, Ezekiel began to change his ways. He dedicated himself to acts of kindness, both large and small. He treated his workers with respect, invested in the community, and began using his wealth to help those in need. The farm, once a symbol of his power and isolation, became a place of generosity and goodwill. Ezekiel's actions did not go unnoticed. The townspeople, once wary of the powerful farmer, began to see him in a new light. His efforts to make amends were sincere, and though they could never erase the past, they brought a sense of purpose to his remaining years. Each day, Ezekiel would spend time in quiet reflection, sitting on the porch where he and Abigail had once shared their dreams. He would think of her, of Noah, and of the life he had lived. The regrets were still there, but they were tempered by the knowledge that he was doing his best to make things right. Scene 5, The Final Redemption. Ezekiel's final act of redemption came one Sunday morning, in the small town's church. He had made a significant donation to the community, funding schools, hospitals, and community centers. It was a gesture of atonement, a way to give back to the people who had given him a second chance at life. He attended the church service, sitting quietly in the back, watching as the townspeople gathered, their faces filled with hope and gratitude. As the service ended, Ezekiel saw Noah and Samuel near the front of the church. Noah's eyes met his, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Noah didn't approach, but he gave Ezekiel a small nod, a sign of acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. It was enough for Ezekiel. He knew that he had done all he could to make amends, and though he could never fully atone for his sins, he had found a measure of peace. As the congregation filed out of the church, Ezekiel remained seated, the quietness of the empty church wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded him for so many years. When he finally stood to leave, Ezekiel knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. The road to redemption had been long and painful, but it had led him to a place of understanding and acceptance. And as he walked out into the bright sunlight, Ezekiel felt, for the first time in years, that he was no longer alone.